Support for First Coast Connect is provided in part by Baptist Health and North Florida TPO.
Good morning, I'm Ann Schindler, and this is First Coast Connect. Today, should the governor offer mercy to military veterans? A new campaign is pushing to stop the executions of former service members after 4 of 11 death row inmates killed so far this year were vets. Later in the program, an author who's made a career of remembering Jacksonville shares the story of Fort Caroline through the eyes of a courageous chambermaid. But first, sending soldiers to war, then sending them to death. It's a circumstance opposed by an increasingly vocal group of death penalty critics. Here to explain why they believe military veterans should be spared the ultimate punishment, we are joined on the phone by Maria DeLiberato, Executive Director of Floridians for Alternatives to the Death Penalty. Good morning, Maria.
Good morning. How are you?
I'm well, and thank you for joining us from Tampa. Joining us from New York is Art Cody, attorney, retired Navy captain, and director of the Center for Veteran Criminal Advocacy. Good morning.
Good morning.
And here in studio, we're also joined by former Navy JAG officer and Capital Criminal Defense Attorney Patrick Korody. Patrick, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
All right, so I'll start with you, Art. We don't know how or why the governor decides to sign a death warrant. And we don't know exactly what he considers, but we do know that some of these cases, invariably are bad crimes. They have bad facts. Can you explain why someone should receive a reprieve from the death penalty simply for military service?
Well, I think that's extremely important to remember is that combat changes people. Our troops coming in, our recruits coming in, are generally coming in with clean records, no misdemeanors, no felony convictions. But what happens to them after they join the military and they are deployed overseas has significant mental health effects upon them. And really, this comes from a variety of sources. But if you think about it, you have 19, 20-year-olds who are going overseas, and they're, particularly in the Iraq and Afghanistan situations, they're under the threat every single day of being killed. In addition to that, there is no safe place in Iraq and Afghanistan during those conflicts. So it's a constant chronic exposure to trauma. Secondarily, they're having to engage people, having to kill people at very, very close range. And I think the other thing to think about is they're exposed to the carnage of war, the aftermath of war. They're seeing the aftermath of war. And I think it's important to remember that if you have people who have such close exposure to violent death on a daily basis, they're not going to come out of that unscathed. They're going to have mental health issues. And we know that going in. We know that when we send our troops overseas, post-traumatic stress is by no means some new phenomenon. It's been in books since Homer, since the Odyssey, All Quiet on the Western Front, from World War I, et cetera, et cetera. So we know these kind of things are going to happen. So we know a certain percentage of our troops, and VA estimates is roughly 30%, are going to come home with post-traumatic issues. The Supreme Court has recognized that people who have mental health disabilities can be exempt from the death penalty. And this is exactly what our troops are going through. They're not the same as they were when they went over. I can't tell you how many times when I'm working with families of clients, they will tell me, we didn't get our son back. They got somebody back dramatically altered by combat. And so at core, what we're saying is that because of the sacrifices that these troops have made for our country and how they've been changed at our behest, and knowing that this was going to happen, come in, it's not appropriate to subject these veterans, these combat veterans, to the ultimate penalty.
Maria DeLiberato, I want to ask you, Florida right now has been on an aggressive track for executions, a record-setting pace right now. We also know that Florida leads in terms of the executions of former service members. Can you talk a little bit about the current campaign to urge the governor to either slow or stop that pace, particularly when it comes to service members?
Sure. We are in sort of unprecedented times in Florida's history with more executions taking place than any other time in Florida's history. We had 11 executions, as you noted, this year, with 2 more scheduled in the month of September. And so I think there's been a lot of opposition from a lot of different groups. There's been a lot of faith leaders speaking out, asking the governor to stop all of these executions. And then lately, there has been a number of them with respect to veterans. And, Art was one of the veterans in that group. The attorney for Kyle Bates, who was executed last month, Tom Dunn, he also spoke. And I think, Art sort of sums it up. No one is saying that these men should escape punishment for what you noted at the beginning are sometimes very, very brutal crimes. What we're saying is that mercy is appropriate and that a life without parole sentence is appropriate. And the death penalty doesn't do anything sort of in general to bring us safety, to bring healing or any of that. It in fact creates more pain, more collateral victims, more collateral damage. So there is sort of a growing opposition, not just among veterans, but certainly Florida has, we've executed 4 veterans this year, all of whom service-related injuries, mental and physical, were directly tied to the mental state at the time of the crime. It's not just that, they served and they committed this murder. They're absolutely inextricably intertwined.
And so this letter that went to the governor recently is signed by more than 130 veterans. Maria, is there any response yet from the governor's office?
There was some, not directly to the veterans or to any of those groups, but there was some response by the governor. He made some remarks outside of Baker Correctional Institution, sort of challenging, and I'll use the word mocking. I think that was his tone, sort of missing the point that it wasn't saying that, they get a free pass because they're veterans. It's saying this should be considered when granting a commutation, when sentencing someone to life without parole. Again, nobody is saying that we open the gates and let folks who've committed violent acts free. But I think it's sort of, it sounded like from his response that he's missing the point and missing the point of what we're trying to do and what these groups are trying to do. And like I've always said since I took over at FADP, was we just want to have an honest conversation about the death penalty, about why it is financially irresponsible, morally irresponsible. It doesn't deter crime. It doesn't keep us any safer. And so I would love to have that conversation. I'm glad that he finally responded. I think he missed the point a little bit, but I certainly would welcome a further conversation about what it is we're trying to do.
Patrick Korody, what are we learning that may be impacting how people think about military service and the death penalty when it comes to things like, Art mentioned PTSD. Certainly that's, a field that has taken conversations in all new directions in the last 20 years or so. But I'm thinking of things too, like, brain injuries that are caused by repeat exposure to, weapons, firings, or being in firefights, or just being around things that are exploding with some frequency.
Right. So traumatic brain injury is real. We know that. The science proves it. And there are a lot of veterans that have suffered brain damage, not only through direct combat operations, but training. There's a lot of things that military service members do that are dangerous, not just when you're overseas, but back home too, in training evolutions. And in many cases that I've done, both for those that have experienced combat and those that have not, getting PET scans, CT scans. A lot of these individuals that end up killing others have brain damage, and that's frontal lobe damage. It's other types of brain damage, but you can look at a brain scan and you can see it. And the science is also clear that impacts judgment, that impacts their ability to control impulsivity, to make rational decisions, to think about long-term consequences. And, that's something that death penalty lawyers are presenting to juries. Whether or not juries give it meaningful consideration and it makes a difference, I don't know, but it's real.
If you're just joining us, we are talking about a push by state advocates to stop further executions of veterans on death row. If you have comments or questions, you can join our conversation at 904-549-2937. You can also email First Coast Connect at wjct.org, or you can reach out on social media. And Patrick, I want to just kind of follow up on that. Certainly defense lawyers are able to and do make argument regarding someone's military service. We'll probably talk a little bit more about the Patrick McDowell case, which happened here in Nassau County, which was a former Marine who was accused, was basically placed on death row for murdering a deputy in Nassau County. And we will talk about that more. But so people can make that case. What about the argument that some are making currently, though, asking the governor to have a sort of a blanket prohibition on death row for former service members? Right now, there are only 2 general exemptions, right, for people, whether they can be executed or not, which is age and
Intellectual disability.
intellectual disability, right? So
Correct.
you can't put juveniles on death row, and you can't put people with a diagnosed intellectual disability on death row.
Correct.
What would be the case for making military service part of that, as opposed to just an argument that you can make to a jury?
Well, a categorical bar, which is, I think, what you're talking about, would essentially, I think, recognize the fact that these service members are part of the 5% of the population that raised their hand, took an oath, and agreed that they would go into harm's way and follow the orders of those appointed over them, all the way up to the President of the United States, but go in harm's way in defense of this country. And I think that it would be more of a recognition of their service and their willingness to do that, because I've represented several veterans, and not all of them have gone to combat. And I think if you're trying to carve out lines to say, well, if they went to combat or they were in a war, then they should be excluded, but those that maybe never made it should not be. I think that would be a very a difficult line to draw. But I do think that a categorical bar would recognize that 5%. And like I said before, I think that training and combat, that all of those things change a person. I represented a client that was a Coast Guard rescue swimmer during Hurricane Katrina, domestic operation, not even combat. And that had a profound impact on his mental health. And he's
I threw up.
serving 15 years in Alabama right now.
So I mentioned the McDowell trial, and we do have some sound from that trial when it was going on. This is a soundbite from David Abramowitz. He actually mentored Patrick McDowell. He works with veterans and the Veterans Treatment Court here in Jacksonville, and he was testifying on Patrick McDowell's behalf. Let's take a listen.
When you saw him on TV,
Yeah.
that was for the shooting of Deputy Moyers, right?
Yeah. I got physically sick. I threw up because it wasn't the man I knew. I blame myself. All right, most veterans, if you know veterans, know if something like this happens, usually the chain of command's responsible, and I'm part of that chain of command. And I just felt so bad for the police officer, obviously, and the family, and the sheriff in Nassau County.
So I want to ask you, Art, this was a case that was incredibly difficult for this community. It involved, a days-long manhunt after this deputy, this really, young, adorable deputy with a family. And, that was a challenge for the community, because the aggravating factors were so hard, I think, for people to deal with. And yet the mitigation that his defense attorneys offered was very, very strong in terms of his military service. He was a Marine. He was recognized as a great leader, a great service member. Can you talk a little bit about that case? It's one that you also had a role in.
Yeah, and I think that the thing to think about with Patrick is that, again, Patrick is one of the many, many service people that we have who come in to the military really with essentially clean records and are ready and willing to serve the country. But what Patrick went through in Iraq, his daily exposure to the threat of being killed in Iraq, and also the importance of what he did in Iraq, his function in Iraq as the battalion commander's radio operator, and how important a job that was. But again, more focusing on the trauma and how it changed him and how his actions really on that day. Now you can say, well, gee, he had other issues going on, but in terms of perhaps drug abuse, etc. But if you trace it all the way back as to, okay, what changed Patrick McDowell and what put Patrick McDowell in this situation, clearly it is his time in Iraq.
Yeah, and there did seem to be a fairly universal agreement on that. So I guess I would ask you, when it comes to, making a decision, whether it's a blanket decision about whether military members should be able to be sentenced to death in Florida, or just argument made, how much of it do you put on the service itself, and how much do you put on the damage that it caused? Because of course, service to our country is in and of itself, a lot of people believe, a significant factor that ought to be considered when somebody is being sentenced for a crime. Is there a way that you can kind of parse what is most significant to you when it comes to
Well, I think
considering that?
you have to get look at the defendant as a whole, and certainly if you look at the case law on it, talks about, and it's a Florida case called Porter v. McCollum, and it talks about how we should consider a person's contributions to the country as well as the trauma they went through, and I think you have to look at that as a whole. And to kind of touch on one of the points that Patrick had brought up, you're really dealing with a very small portion of the American population, 5%. And a lot of that 5%, 5% of the U.S. population are veterans. And a lot of that 5% are Vietnam vets who, sadly are passing. So that number is getting smaller and smaller. But importantly, for that 5%, the military and their combat experiences or their experiences in training is such a dramatic and in many times indelible impact on their lives. But it's something that's very difficult, and this is why we think about this. This is among the reasons we think about this categorical exemption. It's a very difficult thing for people who have not been in combat, who are not veterans, to understand and to give the proper credence to, which is the same thing the Supreme Court has done in other cases, such as the intellectual disability. And that's why we think that based upon their service and what they've went through at our behest and the mental wounds that have been placed upon them, they should be exempt from the ultimate punishment. And as Maria said, we're not talking about this being a get out of jail free card. We're talking about this being a life without parole card. I mean, they will spend the rest of their lives in prison. We're just saying they should be spared this ultimate punishment.
And Captain Cody, you have represented capital case clients for more than 25 years, and you have also been able to obtain clemency for some of them, including a veteran, Jimmy Medders in Georgia. I believe that sentence commutation came just like a couple hours before his scheduled execution. Can you just sort of touch on that experience?
Do you mean the experience in I suppose I would say on that one, in Mr. Medders' case, and he is a good example, because I don't think necessarily that the jury and those that sentenced him had that clearer picture on what his contributions were and what he had done. And one of the things that I worked with Southern Center for Human Rights on that, and Advancing Real Change, which works in mitigation, and we were able to show just what Mr. Medders' contributions had been. And I think it's one of those situations where you have to. Sometimes it's difficult for a jury to completely understand, which again is why we think it should be a categorical exemption.
Maria, when it comes to this categorical exemption, I mean, obviously, you oppose the death penalty. Your organization opposes the death penalty in every circumstance. And I think, what Captain Cody points out, it's not a get out of jail free. It is, you're saying a life without parole. But does it help your cause to kind of split the military into a different group of making an argument specific to them when holistically you object to the death penalty on every basis?
I mean, I think the answer is yes. I mean, there is always room for reformation. Obviously, abolition is our ultimate goal, right? That's no secret. And yet, I think that as we move the conversation forward and begin to educate the public and educate our lawmakers about the people that we are in fact killing, then we move the conversation forward. So certainly, obviously, not executing juveniles, the categorical ban for the intellectually disabled. We've tried unsuccessfully. In some states, they've had success with a ban on the seriously mentally ill, a categorical exemption for those folks, and things like that. So I think that every time we can explain under the law, the death penalty is supposed to be reserved for the most aggravated and the least mitigated, right? The actual worst of the worst. And in practice, that's not what happens. The most people that are on death row had a combination of horrendous childhood trauma, serious mental illness, substance abuse. There are veterans. There are folks in Florida. We've sent a number of people on death row who went to the Dozier School. So that's sort of another example of, violence at the hands of the state or at the behest of the state, and then turn around and we say we're going to execute them. So I think any kind of opportunity to move the conversation forward to explain to the public and to our governor and to the lawmakers that we're not actually killing the worst of the worst. We're killing the sick and the broken.
Yeah, and we did actually do, recently we had a discussion about the Dozier School and the fact that there are so many of those graduates, I guess, or former inmates that are on death row. Patrick, I want to ask you just about the qualities that might make a soldier, perhaps that make them a good soldier, that might also make them somewhat more resistant to treatment, or just the realities of the job that they have, how that can in some ways limit their ability to speak freely. There's certain mandatory reporting responsibilities that a therapist has. So if someone is expressing suicidal or homicidal thoughts, for instance, that can be really problematic for somebody in the military.
National security or the combat effectiveness of the unit. There's supposed to be an intervention at that point as well. In one of the first courts martials I did a long time ago, probably in like 2006, the wars were going on. There was a Navy psychiatrist that came in and testified for the defense. I was the prosecution at the time, and he talked about the fact that the reason that the military likes young men and sends them into war is that, as we all know, that the brain doesn't fully form until the mid-20s in a male. And so they engage in that risky behavior. They'll go take that hill, right, when there are bullets flying by them. They don't think about the long-term consequences of their actions. So those are the exact qualities that the military looks for so that they can send people in harm's way. And then, part of military training or indoctrination is that they train you to follow orders and not question orders, because you need to be able to follow those orders in a combat environment and accomplish the objective. Let's not forget that the military's mission is to kill the enemy, right, and to disable sovereign nations or terrorist groups, right, cripple them, blow things up. And so those are the exact qualities that the military is looking in service members: follow orders and go engage in this risky behavior. And those risky behaviors are really what I've seen in a lot of my clients that ultimately lead to a situation where they choose to take someone else's life, and it lands them in a lot of water. So their inability to rationally think about putting the brakes on and the long-term consequences. As far as resources, I have over 20 years of military service, and I've seen the resources available in the military with respect to mental health have dramatically increased during my time, as well as I think the stigma associated with it has decreased dramatically.
We actually have a question that was just emailed to us on that topic, so I may just ask you directly. Michael's saying, if we know just how much of a deleterious effect exposing people to the horrors of war can have on their mental and emotional health, what steps are taken when troops come home to reintegrate them into civil society without being a threat to themselves or others? Is there something that is done uniformly for people if they don't seek out treatment or if they don't express that they're experiencing a problem?
And that's the one of the biggest problems is if people don't ask for help, how do you help them, right? But I can tell you from my own experience in my service that there are all types of debriefings and mandatory screenings that military members do when they come home from deployment. Whether or not those military members answer truthfully and take advantage of the resources is a different story, because there are people that still are afraid of reporting, because it can, at the end of the day, med you down or put you on what's called a profile in the Army or limited duty in the Navy, and that essentially takes you out of where you are with your colleagues, right? Those that you serve with. and put you in a medical status while they're trying to figure out what's wrong with you and can they rehabilitate you. And if they can't rehabilitate you, you're looking at medical separation or medical retirement. So there are people that do not honestly report what they're going through to avoid that consequence.
I mean, even if they get help, I would guess that there are people, I mean, that it could impact your promotability, your career in the long term, even if you are able to get the treatment that you need.
I think it could. I think that's possible because you may be taken out of your traditional career progression while you're getting help.
Yeah. We talked about the McDowell case. I do want to just play some sound from McDowell himself. So he testified. He ultimately said that he did not want to be spared the death penalty, and he addressed the court explaining why that was. Let's take a listen to that.
Someone killed my stepdad, my brother, and my friends who were cops in such a cold, selfish, callous way. I'd want them dead, and to hell with whatever excuses they present to explain it away. I can't live with the thought of the murder I've committed being overshadowed by my life, my military service, my traumatic experiences, or my drug use. I don't want to die, but why should what I want matter?
So, Captain Cody, I want to ask you about that. Obviously, that had a great impact on the jury in this case, and maybe was a decisive factor for them in voting for death in this case. But Patrick McDowell ultimately decided that whatever excuse or rationale could be drawn for his service and his ultimate act, that he didn't believe that was sufficient. So I guess I would ask you, as somebody who worked on that case, if the defendant doesn't believe that that's sufficient, why should the rest of us in the state or in juries believe that that's a legitimate carve out?
Well, I think you have to consider that the client is not always the best person to assess their mental health, and normally absolutely not the best person to assess their mental health. And I think, so I'm going to touch on something Patrick said, in that culturally, the way the military works, we don't think, like, for example, in all the units I was in during my 34 years in the military, none of them had as their motto, practice self-introspection every day, or your mental health comes first. Very much we are mission driven, we're other people driven. We think about ourselves last, which I think to some degree is what's going on with Patrick, with Patrick in Patrick's case. So I think in asking Patrick to assess whether it is or isn't a factor, the real factor is, how damaged was he from war, and how did that affect him, regardless what he may think, and how much self-consciousness he has, and how guilty he feels about what he did. The real issue is not necessarily what Patrick thinks, but overall, what should we as a society be doing? Should we be, as a society, taking these warriors, taking these young people who have been through this on our behalf, and then putting them to death?
Maria, I want to ask you about the Cale Bates. He was executed most recently. He was in the National Guard, and he didn't serve in wartime per se, kind of served during some riots in Florida. But his case raised questions of racial discrimination when it comes to the death penalty. And I wonder if you could just sort of lay out what it is, because it's not necessarily that there are more black than white death row inmates being executed. It seems like that somewhat mirrors the population. But in terms of the victim profiles, can you sort of explain what that argument is?
Yes. So for Kyle Bates, the lawyers raised, among many things, with respect to him and a denial of DNA testing and lots of things. But with respect to the racial claim, it was that the percentage of white victims versus black victims. So the death penalty, we know, is more sought when the victims are white than black. And the warrant selection process, which, of course, as you noted at the beginning of this program, is completely secret. We have no idea how, when they are chosen. It puts Florida as an absolute outlier in that the governor has sole discretion on who lives or dies and when. There's no sort of mechanism or transparency about how that's chosen. And what the Bates team noted was a disparity in the race of the victim. So for 95% of the executions to date under Governor DeSantis, the victims had been white. And so that was an issue that they raised. And of course, Kyle Bates, the same, was a black man with a white victim. What was sort of interesting, I think most telling about that was the response by the state. So 2 hours after that lawsuit was filed alleging that racial disparity, the governor signed a warrant for Curtis Wyndham, who killed 3 Black people. And at the time it was odd because there had never been 3 death warrants pending at a time in Florida's recent history, certainly not since I started doing this work 19 years ago. And so that was sort of odd. But what really sort of hit the point home was a couple of days later when the Bates team, the attorney general for Bates, filed their response to the lawsuit. They challenged the statistics and they said, no, look, we're much more even now because we added these 3 Black victims. And so it seemed retaliatory. It seemed absolutely purposeful to try to pad their statistics to make that disparity not accurate. Because what they said was, now look at the Wyndham victims, we are much more on par with about 16%. I don't have the numbers right in front of me, but we are on par with the population of Black people in Florida with the number of Black victims executed. But what they failed to mention is, but for the retaliatory signing of the Wyndham warrant, that would be down to 7% or half. So again, it's sort of we're stacking more and more evidence of a lot of arbitrariness in Florida's death penalty, in the selection process, in the execution selection process. Of course, we have non-unanimity. There's just a number of growing problems with Florida's death penalty, and it's really, really broken. But that is, I think, the Bates and the Wyndham warrant juxtaposition back side to side really show some very, very disturbing calculated behavior.
And Maria, you talked about the process. Can you just explain to us how Florida's process, when it comes to the governor selecting someone for a death warrant, how that happens, what we know about that, and how that is maybe different from other states?
Yeah, I mean, we don't know much other than we know that so Florida, unlike other states, there's a clemency process, but there's no clemency decision. So in other states, there's a clemency hearing and a decision, a vote, a recommendation by the board or not. And then usually an execution is set in some orderly process through a court, through a motion on the attorney general, and they're set, spaced out. In Florida, there's a clemency hearing, and then there's no word, there's no decision, there's no response until a death warrant is signed, which says clemency has been denied. And so there's not been clemency granted in more than 30 years in Florida. I think it was the early 80s, and that was one time. And so there's no clemency as fail-safe, and we have no idea. Some of these folks who he signed warrants on have had clemency in the last year. Some of them had clemency 10 years ago. So you are eligible for execution in Florida once you have been through all of your appeals and have had clemency, but there's no rhyme or reason as to when. And there's been numerous, public records attempts, litigation, as far as trying to figure that out. We know that there are some victims that are, advocating for it. And so are those cases getting more attention? We just don't know. Is there consultation between the Attorney General's office? We certainly suspect so. But the courts and the governor and the Attorney General's office have all been extremely tight-lipped and not transparent. And that is troubling in and of itself, right? If this is a fair process that is not arbitrary and not racist and not disparate in any other way, then why can't we have a transparent process like there are in other states?
Patrick, I will ask you just kind of as a final question. We know that there's sort of declining support nationwide for the death penalty over recent years. Florida is particularly military friendly. Our governor is a military veteran. Do you sense that might give this effort to spare military veterans the ultimate punishment might gain a foothold in a way that other arguments against the death penalty in Florida might not?
I sincerely hope it does. You're right. Our governor is a prior Navy judge advocate. He did do a tour in Iraq, so he is uniquely familiar with the conditions over there. And unfortunately, the push in Florida right now is to expand the death penalty, expand its use, make it easier to execute people. And maybe this is something that can reverse that trend.
Yeah. Well, Patrick Korody, Maria DeLiberato, and Art Cody, thank you all so much for joining us this morning. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
All right. Up next, a Jacksonville author with a taste for history explores the story of Fort Caroline. Welcome back. Well, she's known for digging into local pieces of Jacksonville history, including iconic restaurants and putt-putt courses. Her latest book goes back a little farther to the storied history of Fort Caroline. Here to tell us about it is Dorothy Fletcher, longtime educator and author. Good morning, Dorothy.
Good morning.
So first of all, congratulations on the new book. You have written a number of books. You were a former Times Union columnist. You wrote By the Wayside.
Yes. Yes.
And so you have long profiled people in the story of Jacksonville, whether it's skating rinks or soda fountains, So first of all, what was it that, what kind of response did you get to the work that you did when you were writing those kind of nostalgic look backs at Jacksonville history?
It was very popular. It seemed to me people were writing in, and then I'd meet a lot of people and go, "Oh, I read that," and I used to love the skating rink, and whatever it was I was writing about. And if you, those were all things that I loved, so I figured it would hit a chord with other people too.
Yeah, and so you kind of compiled some of these into the first book that you did, not just
Correct.
what you'd written, but some of the email responses that you got from
Yeah.
people with sharing their memories.
Yes, yes, and that was very, uh, you know, vindicating or whatever.
Yeah,
It
yeah.
was fun.
I mean, there's obviously an appetite for that. I see
Hmm.
now on Facebook there's certain pages that try to replicate that, but
Hmm.
there's no longer a community section of the newspaper that does that
I
kind of.
know. That's just one day my section was gone.
Yeah.
I said, "Am I fired?" And they said, "Well, yeah, kind of." I said,
Well,
"Okay."
it is a loss. This new book is a different,
Yeah.
longer look back.
Right.
Certainly, you're looking back in the
15,
1500s. Yeah.
yes. It's about, it just takes a female perspective of the expedition that went to Fort Caroline. And it also is the only woman who's really even mentioned in any of Laudonnière's memoirs. And she was so fascinating to me that I said, well, I got to give her a voice.
And this is a woman who worked as the chambermaid for René
Correct.
Laudonnière. And so, first of all, remind us who he was, what role he played in Fort Caroline.
In the beginning, when the first time when he came with Ribot, he was second in command. But when it was time to build the actual fort, Ribot is in prison.
Okay.
So they said, okay, Laudonnière, you take it. And so he took Huguenots because they were trying to get rid of that particular group of people because there was so much discord going on, religious
Over religion,
discord,
yeah.
yes. And they just thought that would be a great thing to do.
And Huguenots were basically like not Catholics, right?
Oh yeah, that's a pejorative term. It means conspirator, but they really were Calvinists, is
Okay.
what they are.
All right.
And so it was really fun to delve into that too, because I'm a Presbyterian, which is
Okay.
from the Calvinists. So
Sure.
but she would have been in a position to know an awful lot about what was going on because she would have been in his household. But she gets into a scandal because the mutineers were trying to discredit Laudonnière, and but she was not his mistress,
Okay.
as they would
Just a
try
true
to say.
domestic worker.
Really,
Yeah.
and but very much revered toward the end, the
And
book.
she didn't have a name in these journals. You actually had to name her as
I
you.
did. Women weren't mentioned.
Mhm.
There are tons of men's names, but not a single female. So I just took Elle from the French, meaning she, and chérie, which is a term of endearment, and put it together, and she became Ellie. But I'm sure most people will call her Ellie.
Yeah.
It's
And
okay.
so, what do you think that telling her story brings to the broader story of Fort Caroline?
Well, for one thing, I think it personalizes it in ways that have not been done. Fiction, you can do that more, I think. You kind of play the what if game. Well, what if I were this person? How would I view the story? And you get to see the day to day sort of thing. It was a really grueling experience, I would think, from what I gathered from all the
Sure.
documents. But I can imagine, living outside in Florida in a swamp,
Yeah.
that would
And
be pretty.
I mean, ultimately, the Huguenots were basically slaughtered, right?
Oh, it was horrible, and um, it they really wiped out. They went from like 600 to down to 60.
Yeah.
But,
And so they were all killed at the fort, and then a whole other contingent of them was killed down at Fort Matanzas, which
yeah,
actually
correct.
means slaughter. Yeah.
Exactly.
Um,
Yeah.
and so you have an upcoming event at the Florida Historical Society's
Yes.
Library of Florida History.
Yes.
That's on September 6th. Can you tell us what it is that you're going to present? And congrats on that as well.
Oh, thank you. Well, I'm going to present, a PowerPoint, such as it is. That's my speed. And but basically show them what the fort looked like, the environs. Of course, Fort Caroline is going to be changed very soon, I think, because they keep getting flooded and the displays destroyed. So,
And that's like the replica, because we don't really know where
right.
the original fort is, right?
Yeah, it could have been out in the middle of the river because in 450 years, there'd be an awful lot of change in the coastline.
Sure.
But it's interesting. I just went out there recently, and it's getting a little shabby.
Is
'Cause
it?
it needs not updating necessarily, but fixing.
Yeah. And so they're looking at relocating it so it's not getting inundated all the
Right.
time. And so you're going to tell people about that, and I guess tell them about the
Right.
book. You'll also be selling the book.
Oh yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
of course.
If people want to get a copy of it, where can they get it? I mean, along with your other books, they're often sold like at the Historical Society.
Right.
Yeah.
The Historical Society, the museums, Cummer's going to have it. Beaches. As a matter of fact, the Beaches Museum is going to do a kind of launch for me
Oh, nice.
on the 2nd of October. And then always on Amazon. Oh, and the bookmark down at the Beaches carrying it. And, hopefully I'm working on Barnes and Nobles and those sorts of things. That takes a while.
And do you have your next project in mind?
No, no, this is hard enough to get this one rolling. So
Yeah.
yeah, but I'll find something.
Yeah. Well, Dorothy Fletcher has got a number of great books, and they're all worth checking out, whether you want to know more about the Goonie Golf dinosaur that's now on Beach Boulevard, or just the great old restaurants
Oh yeah.
of the bygone days of Jacksonville. Well, congrats, Dorothy Fletcher,
Thank
again.
you.
Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Ann.
All right. Up next, from the lectern to the gallery, Flagler Art faculty open their portfolios for students and the community.
Lutheran Social Services presents Two Piano Journey, a benefit featuring mother-son piano duo Chris and Michelle Kuo. Saturday, September 13th at 7 p.m. at Friday Musicale. Next stop, Carnegie Hall. Tickets available at lssjacks.org. The Jacksonville Jazz Collective explores the rich history of jazz guitar on September 20th with a jazz guitar quartet featuring James Hogan, Barry Green, John Lumpkin, and Scott Giddens. Live in Jacoby Symphony Hall. Tickets at jacksymphony.org.
On the next Fresh Air, Jane Fonda. At the age of 87, the Academy Award-winning actor is pouring her energy into activism. She'll reflect on her decades-long career, how she first began her fitness empire to fund her activist work, and why the first season of the Netflix series Grace and Frankie sent her back into therapy. Join us.
Today at noon on WJCT News 89.9.
The renowned historian David Blight says he's fed up. The country's narrative, our collective history as we know it, is under attack, and it's time to fight back.
What President Trump did was to declare political war on the practice of history, on the teaching of history, on American scholarship.
David Blight and what he calls Trump's assault on history. That's on the next On Point.
Today at 11 on WJCT News 89.9.
President Trump says he has the right to send National Guard troops to cities with Democratic leadership, a show of force that he's already demonstrated in Washington, D.C. and Los Angeles. What do Trump's comments say about how he views his presidential power and how our state's pushing back? A look into the Trump administration and the National Guard. That's next time on 1A.
Today, starting at 10 on WJCT News 89.9.
Well, more than a dozen fine art and graphic design professors do rather than teach at an upcoming exhibition of their own work. The show includes painting, sculpture, photography, printmaking, and digital design. Here to tell us about it is Julie Dickover, director of the Crisp Art Museum at Flagler College. Good morning, Julie.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I mean, so faculty are well accustomed to looking at and critiquing their own students' work, and this turns the tables a little bit.
Yes.
Why is it important for faculty to have an opportunity or to be required or whatever it is to show their own work?
Well, I mean, like you said, faculty are the ones who are doing the critiquing most of the time in the classes. And I think it's a really great teaching tool for students to be able to see the work that their professors are making in a professional setting. You know, Flagler College, the Department of Visual Arts has a lot of really wonderful artists and designers who are part of the program, and they have robust artistic practices of their own. So, yeah, for students to be able to see what the professors are working on while they're also teaching is super important.
I think it must shape too how a teacher teaches, how a teacher even gives feedback when they also are on the receiving end of that from their students. I would guess it sort of changes the dialogue or the dynamic a little bit.
Yeah, because I mean, professors, you know, they're teaching their students, but they're also making their own work. So, I do really think that it's a powerful teaching tool.
Yeah, and art can be very revealing about an artist too. I mean, it's a little bit like seeing your teacher at the grocery store or something, right? You're seeing like a different side of them when you see their artwork.
Yeah, and I think it's also important too for students to understand that their teachers are also working artists, right? I mean, teaching is sort of their occupation, their job, but art is also their job.
Yeah. And Flagler has a really extraordinary, I mean, for a school of its size, it has always had a really strong arts program with just incredible artists. And I think of people like Enzo Torcoletti, the sculptor, Maureen O'Neill, the painter, but currently you've got people like Sarah Pedigo, Patrick Moser. So tell us about the kind of work that this exhibit will showcase.
Sure. Okay. So, I mean, a lot of your listeners probably recognize some of these names. Sarah Pedigo is a great painter. She's showing her work all over, and I'm sure people have seen her work in Northeast Florida in a gallery or museum setting. Patrick Moser, he historically has been a painter, and then maybe 20 years ago, he started veering more into making video, and he's been making these sort of experimental shorts that he's shown in, film festivals all over the world, really. And then he wants Don Martin, who was our resident printmaking professor when he retired. Some of those printmaking classes Patrick started teaching, so now he's been dabbling in printmaking. So there's one of his videos, a couple of his prints. We've got work from, excuse me, some of our part-time people. So Luke Broderson, who is one of the co-founders with his wife Danielle of Future Friends, a graphic design firm based in St. Augustine. And I think that many of you who have come to St. Augustine and gone to some of the restaurants like the Floridian or Bees, they'll see some of the branding and logos that Future Friends have done. So they always outdo themselves for our faculty show. And they make, a display of the work that they've done.
The school has also turned out a number of great local artists, people who are still making art in the community after graduating, people like Joe Siegel, Teresa Siegel, they're
exactly.
both, making beautiful, very different kinds of pieces. And so this is, I think helpful for students, but also I imagine just a really nice opportunity for for the community to see what's being created locally.
Yeah, definitely. This is always one of my favorite shows to have at the Crisp. We don't do them that often. I have a faculty show every few years, but yeah, it's a great opportunity for the community. Same thing as the students. It's a great opportunity for the community to see the work that these faculty are making, and they really have a significant impact on our community. They're showing work. They're putting St. Augustine on the map in a lot of ways, and as you mentioned, Flagler, our Department of Fine Arts, our Department of Visual Arts, is small but mighty.
Yeah.
And we churn out, great artists and designers and art historians, because let's not forget the art historians. They're a part of that department as well. And we have a great arts administration minor. And so, we've been sort of pushing out a lot of culturally focused people, students who've graduated over the years.
Yeah, well, it's a great set of alumni. The exhibit is September 5th to November 8th, and is there kind of like a opening reception on Friday?
Yeah, so this Friday, 5 to 8, concurrent with St. Augustine's First Friday Art Walk, we'll have the opening. And then around 6 o'clock, we're keeping it a little bit informal, but we'll do a walkthrough of the exhibition with a few of the artists who will be on hand to talk about their work. And we will be scheduling some programming throughout the course of the exhibition. One that we have on the books currently is a lecture by an assistant professor, Dr. Stephanie Holios, who will be doing a lecture on October 29th, I believe, in the Virginia Room to talk about her work. Art History as Community Engagement is the title of that.
All right.
Lecture.
Well, Julie Dickover, director of the Crisp Elliott Art Museum at Flagler College, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
All right, and thank you for listening. If you missed anything, you can catch our rebroadcast at 8 o'clock tonight or find our entire archive at wjct.org or your favorite podcast platform. Join us tomorrow when we talk to Dr. Joe Servin about the latest medical headlines, including pregnancy robots. I'm Ann Schindler. You've been listening to First Coast Connect on WJCT News 89.9.
Support for First Coast Connect is provided by Baptist Health and the North Florida TPO.
Baptist Health is a proud supporter of First Coast Connect. Baptist Health, committed to building a healthier community for all of us. More info at 202-4YOU or baptistjacks.com. The North Florida TPO is committed to shaping our transportation future. We're focused on planning, funding, clean fuels, and new technologies for a vibrant, connected community. Learn more at northfloridatpo.com.
Listen to Anthology on 89.9 HD3 and let the music unlock